Welcome all to today's webinar with Charlie Betts from Armstrong Process Group. Today's webinar is IT4IT towards a digital operating model. I'd like to now introduce Charlie Betts. Welcome and thank you so much, Charlie, for presenting today's webinar.
And thank you, Birgit. Can you hear me?
Very
Am I coming
clear.
Through?
Yeah,
Good.
If any folks are having problem with audio, please send us a message via the chat window. Thank you.
Great, and thanks again. Welcome all. The title of today's presentation is IT4IT Toward the Digital Operating Model. And a little bit about me. I tend to not go into great depth about myself since we all have access to LinkedIn nowadays. And I will say I'm an author and I've been an enterprise architect at companies like Best Buy and Wells Fargo. I am currently working on a textbook called Digital from Startup to Enterprise, and I have a long-standing interest in large-scale IT operating models and related questions. So I'm here on behalf of Armstrong Process Group today. APG is based in Wisconsin and has an overall mission of aligning information technology and systems engineering capabilities with business strategy using proven practical processes delivering world-class results. APG is active in the Open Group, the Object Management Group, and has significant business partnerships with Sparks, HP, and IBM. Of course, IT4IT is a product of the IT4IT Forum, which is part of the Open Group. It's an open global consortium that develops vendor-neutral IT standards and certifications, including, as many of you know, TOGAF, Archimate, so on. And there is a very diverse membership on both the supply and demand side of the IT4IT community. The memberships, the consortium memberships are 488, and there are a wide variety of participants active in various working groups and other open group forums, as you can see here from the graphic on the page. Some of the open group objectives are listed here that are especially germane to IT4IT, including using information technology more efficiently and effectively, gaining business benefit, and allowing individuals to better develop their skills and capabilities. This is done through establishing work groups and forums that develop the standards, guides, practices, and white papers, and publishing these to the world and operating certification and accreditation programs. Now, IT4IT itself is an evolving standard to provide a vendor-neutral, technology-agnostic, and industry-agnostic reference architecture for managing the business of IT. The intent is to enable execution more efficiently and effectively in an industry-independent way, and it is designed for both existing landscapes as well as accommodating future IT and digital paradigms. I'll put in the word digital. So IT4IT is in many ways the culmination of work that I became interested in probably in the 2002-2003 timeframe, the whole question of why is IT undermanaged by comparison to peer organizations. And of course, in 2002-2003, we were still suffering from, I think, some of the worst periods in IT delivery and reputation. Things have gotten markedly better recently with the Agile and DevOps movements having real impact. But we still see in especially larger organizations a tendency for IT to be siloed, and certainly the phenomenon of reinventing the wheel. and this was very much apparent to me. So one aspect of my experience I didn't talk about was when I was at Wells Fargo, I was the chief architect, ultimately VP for the business of IT, the architecture of the business of IT. I often say I never had that much experience in banking per se, but with a $5 billion a year IT supply chain, I had all I could do to keep up with just delivering IT services. And these were the difficult questions of, how do portfolio management and service management interact? What about this CMDB? How does it relate to enterprise architecture? And all of the other related questions that you run into when you're running large-scale digital delivery. And I went off and wrote a book, which was a few slides back, called Architecture and Patterns for IT, based in part on my experiences with Wells Fargo. Names changed to protect the innocent, of course, in the book. And I went on in my career, and a number of years later, I received a phone call from Carol Van Thieland at Shell. And the conversation went like this. Carol said, "Charlie, we have your book at Shell. We use it. We get some value from it. We are starting a consortium with HP to actually develop a reference architecture so that we can stop reinventing these wheels and everybody winds up developing essentially the same architecture and asking these same questions over and over again. For example, CMDB versus enterprise architecture, so on." And I promptly joined the consortium. It was not a hard thing for me to align with and feel supportive of, and the rest, as they say, well, it brings us here today. We got this quote from Gartner a couple years back. The redundancy in large-scale IT delivery is significant. IT people love our tools, and we often see that we have one of everything. Now, sometimes that makes sense. Event management on the mainframe is not the same as event management in the Linux world. You do need two different event management tools. But when it starts to get into multiple service desks, multiple portfolio management systems, multiple request systems, systems that should be platform independent, and we start to see the redundancy that exists in the large-scale IT organizations, well, I think the Gartner quote, is compelling, and even at 5%, that's a lot of money. We started off with roughly 8 or 9 of us. The original consortium started to develop the first stirrings of the work in 2011. I think I joined in 2012 timeframe, maybe 2013. And quite a bit of work was achieved. And at a certain point, it was decided that, either we start our own consortium, start our own nonprofit to standardize this, or perhaps we might go with an organization that had more experience in such things. A decision that, in hindsight, I am very glad we took, because there's a lot to producing an industry standard. There's marketing and IP and conferences, and it was clearly going to be a tall order for us to start such a thing from scratch. So we had a number of conversations and ultimately aligned IT4IT with the open group. Roughly, I believe, 10 to 20 person years of intellectual property was deeded over from HP to the open group, much to the credit of HP, and is now this open standard. I need to update this. This is now a few months old, but it was current as of June 2016. Very pleased. In addition to the founding members, we have ServiceNow has joined. Boeing has been active. I could go down the list, obviously. We have a number of interested parties, and we have a number of the entrepreneurial consultancies and training providers that are starting to actually gear up and deliver IT4IT training. So what is IT4IT? It's a series of it's represented as a series of artifacts. It is a reference architecture, and as a reference architecture, it focuses on what you might call the systems or application layer and the data layer. It does not have a complete business architecture per se, and we're discussing that currently. But the value chain is, at the high level, an overall framing mechanism that begins to show indications of process at the very highest level. You might call these value streams: strategy to portfolio, requirement to deploy, request to fulfill, detect to correct. Some people call them process scenarios, and those of you with a background in enterprise resource planning may see the similarity here to how we think about things in the ERP space. We often talk about processes like hire to retire, procure to pay, quote to cash, idea to product. I mean, there's a wide variety of them. When I first saw these, and I had built my own IT value chain in my book, and I had taken almost a 90-degree different approach, but when I saw what they had done, it resonated immediately, and I had no hesitation at all in adopting it and saying, this is very solid, high-level abstraction work, not easy to get right, very easy to get wrong, and they did it right. Because the trouble with the IT value chain is it's too broad, too abstract, and you can't count it, but you do have countability. And those of you who are architects who have worked with business process managers, you understand the importance of countability, and that value stream level takes it down to the highest and yet still countable level that we can actually reason about with some level of precision. The supporting activities are still work in process. They may change, but I believe that that is it's a reasonable first approximation what we have there. The value streams, and I know this is an eye chart. This is not a cat deck. We all know the current style is to have a picture of a furry kitten and one word, such as meow or furry. The trouble with those kinds of decks is they're harder to refer to after the fact. This, on the other hand, goes to the opposite extreme of an overly detailed slide that one could stare at offline for some time. So, begging your indulgence for going to that extreme, we see that each value stream itself has a set of key activities and high-level functions or stages that you might consider. Now, of course, we all know that waterfall development is being left behind, and the simple existence of, say, plan and design as separate from develop, as separate from test, as separate from deploy, makes no statement about the frequency with which you're doing these things. We certainly recognize that large batches of functionality moving in a very sequential manner across these stages is simply not how effective IT delivery is happening nowadays, and yet still developing is a different set of concerns than deployment. Request to fulfill, I think, is a very interesting one because that is the consumer experience of digital value, and we often hear much less about this particular aspect of digital delivery. So I think it's perhaps the least intuitive, and because of that, the most interesting of the value streams. Detect to correct, of course, is your core operational feedback loop back into the upstream concerns, but has that basic set of concerns such as detecting via event management, marshaling, dispatching, say through incident management, making changes as necessary both to solve the immediate incident as well as perhaps the root cause if you bring in the problem management view. And those of you with the background in ITIL will recognize those as the keywords of the way ITIL views the incident and related processes. Now, the value chain, of course, is a very high-level framing artifact, and as we take it down a level, you'll still see the value streams listed in the reference architecture, but now we have these blue rectangles and black circles, which is what we call the reference architecture level 1 or the functional component architecture. Now, the functional components are not capabilities. They are best seen as systems, applications, if you will, or service systems, if you will. And this is deliberate because we know that there are a variety of ways that we understand IT and digital delivery in terms of processes, and the intent of IT4IT is to some extent to be process agnostic once you get past the major value streams. Now, some might say, well, how can you set up your systems if you don't know all your processes? But the interesting thing is that in the year 2016, these functional components exist. I can go to the market and I can show you source control components and build components and event components. I can go into organizations and point to those being used in operational forms. And so I think that grounding the architecture in these inarguable, unambiguous points of, well, what are we seeing in actual practice is actually an interesting and very solid way of developing an architectural perspective on these problems, and one that keeps us away from arguments around process that can go on for some time and never be resolved to everybody's satisfaction. And I spoke too much on the previous slide. My apologies. I tend to get ahead of myself a little bit. But again, here, this is perhaps less of an eye chart. Here you can see the functional components in their full, at a full scale. Like I said, one of the acid tests that I like to apply to these is, can you show me one of these existing in the market? And for the most part, they meet that criteria. Can you show me one of these in the wild? Can you show me one of these at a customer site? And I think, again, that provides us a consensus point that we can base the architecture upon, regardless of our opinions about higher order questions such as what is a capability, what is a service, and what is a process, and so on. So IT4IT was written from the perspective of and for the value of consuming organizations like ExxonMobil and Shell and others. I certainly saw the value of it. I wish it had existed when I was doing similar work 10 years ago at a major U.S. bank. I felt I knew at the time I must be reinventing the wheel. And it's interesting, you know, I'll just as an aside, we know that various consultancies have actually developed business of IT reference architectures. This is not a new line of work. There's been a number of examples of this. I think what distinguishes IT4IT is this is the first open and collaborative example of that kind of work, but the work's been done before. Now, for the software vendors, it helps them focus on what's differentiating versus non-differentiating. For the integrators, it gives them additional tool in the toolbox, additional feather in the cap in terms of what they have to offer the market. And I think I'll talk a little bit more about how this is a personal professional development opportunity. I think that's one of the more interesting and less appreciated aspects of standards work. I believe I have a slide on that towards the end. Okay, so this is the probably the most conceptually difficult slide in the deck. But I've presented it many times, and nobody has yet said to me, Charlie, you just got to move away from that slide. It's too much. Because it explains an important aspect of IT4IT, and that is the question of how it fits with the other standards. Now, along the bottom, we have a topic scope that is roughly moving from multi-industry through shared functions into verticals. So that's one dimension. But the vertical dimension is one that needs some thought. It is the degree of prescriptiveness. So it's not how ambitious the standard is. It's not whether the standard is about governance versus management. It's about how precise the standard is. Some standards require lawyers to interpret and accountants to interpret, like GAAP. Nobody would say that GAAP is not a standard, but if you look at it, it's mostly narrative. It is not an architecture. You can't parse GAAP unless you're a lawyer, unless you're a human being. On the other hand, at the syntactically precise level, you have standards like XBRL. Now, I line up XBRL and GAAP in the same finance vertical, but XBRL is the precise, syntactically precise representation of a subset of GAAP, arguably, the reporting subset. And then, for example, at the higher, more conceptual level, even in multi-industry, we have work such as VCore, SCORE, APQC, and how is that implemented in a interoperability level? It's implemented through EDI and similar technologies. So I think you see where I'm going with this. IT4IT, ITIL, for example, ITIL, I have the ITIL books. Actually, they're rather expensive, cost about $600, and it's 2,000 pages of nicely produced, very well-written narrative. A lot of check boxes, a lot of bullet points, not very structured, definitely computation independent. And IT4IT, I can't speak for the forum as a whole or predict the future, but I would be very surprised if IT4IT becomes 2,000 pages of narrative guidance. IT4IT is maybe 1/10 that size. It is much more precise. It uses architectural semantics and syntax. So it kind of centers on the logical world. And in doing this, it is comparable to standards that many of you on the phone may be familiar with, such as the ETOM family in the telco world, and of course, that's a whole suite of things like frameworks and MDAS and SIDS, and yes, I realize that. The ACORD standard in insurance, the BIAN and MDDL standards in banking, the Association for Retail Technology System Services standards, the Association for Retail Technology Standards. I have some friends over there. They've been doing great work, defining retail, logical, and syntactically precise, fully attributed models for the business of retail, so on and so forth. So where it would be very difficult, for example, to compare ITIL or COBIT directly to ETOM, the intention is that IT4IT is directly comparable to ETOM. And hopefully this clarifies the standard's positioning, because of course this is one of the most frequently asked questions we get. Moving on. So IT4IT, I'm going to switch now to some of the applications of IT4IT and how you can use it and how it can be interpreted. Those who know me know that the Agile ecosystem is a topic of some concern and interest for me. I've been following and practicing Agile for some time, and one of the earliest scenarios that we wrote using the reference architecture was an Agile scenario where we looked at how we might apply IT4IT given the guidance that was coming from the Agile community, what IT4IT's relationship might be. And this is done with some realization of the fact that actually the Agile community tends to be a bit skeptical of standards. And this is, I think, an ongoing conversation. I find myself in a bit of a paradoxical point of view advocating for a standard, and yet also very aware of some of the philosophical inclinations of the Agile community. So, but I think it was possible. It is possible. I believe it was, believe it is possible to actually define a set of objectives for IT4IT that reflected what we saw coming from the Agile community. Certainly, the centrality of version control is inarguable. It's one of the 4 fundamental principles of the Agile movement, according to the Agile Alliance. And Andrew Clay Schaefer, now of Cloud Foundry and Pivotal, has stated categorically that it is the fundamental discipline that enables all the rest of Agile, and I do not think that is an overstatement. We have a need to support forward transparency so that people are no longer surprised by work sailing over the wall, shared visual mental models, limiting work and process and understanding cues. I will go into some detail on that, and showing patterns for how fast feedback is actually implemented in significant digital delivery chains, and identifying the industry consensus components across the core of Dev and Ops. These have all been done in the white paper. For example, and this is an example of what we call a level 3 architecture in IT4IT. This is a detailed architecture suggestion, non-normative, but it is an example of how you might use IT4IT components to think about the core DevOps pipeline. This is actually just a fragment of the core DevOps pipeline that shows how source control and might interact with the fulfillment execution component, which is a generic term for a workflow engine. And then that may flow into build management, and that may flow into release design, which in this version is where the package is stored. Actually, I'm seeing that I think this actually might be a bit outdated because there is also a package component now in IT4IT. And then, of course, you run automated tests as based on build management. Certainly, we can see practical examples of this if you run Jenkins and you run a set of JUnit tests. You execute the tests, and if the tests are throwing defects, then those need to get logged into a defect management component. For example, you might use JIRA. Managing queues becomes a critical concern, and I have a few what you could call cat slides here. So this is a slide in the modern style. For example, if you look at IT4IT, some but not all of the components might have a queue. Notably, we typically don't see queues in enterprise architecture or configuration management tools, but we certainly do see them wherever we're tracking work, such as requirements, defects, problems, incidents, changes, and service requests, and so on. So by highlighting the queues, this allows you to reason about your digital delivery pipeline, a very important practice and one that is receiving more and more attention in the Agile and digital world. One of the reasons that you want to reason about your queues is because you want to tighten the feedback loops. Now, what do we mean by that? Developing digital systems is a form of product development, and product development relies on feedback. It relies on fast feedback. You might hear the term fail fast. I'm not a fan of that term. I think it carries a little bit too much baggage, but the reason that we want to fail fast is because by failing, we generate information. I prefer the idea of generate information fast. But when you have long delays in your release process, in your testing process, in your provisioning process, in your testing process, your feedback loops are too long and people get distracted. You wind up with too much work in process in the system. We can use IT4IT to start to highlight some of these issues and have systematic conversations about this. For example, there should be feedback loop from problem to defect, from service monitoring to requirements. Perhaps that goes via defects. There's a number of different paths that you can see where feedback needs to flow back upstream. The offer consumption, the actual use, utilization, popularity of given services published and accessed via request to fulfill. Well, certainly you would want to consider that as a feedback loop back into your portfolio management system. So you decide, well, what changes do I need to make to my portfolio of requestable services? It's also important in terms of seeing blockages, seeing where work in process blocks. And For example, you can use IT4IT, and now I'm speaking to the consultants and trainers in the room. You can use it as a basis for digital and DevOps value stream mapping. You can use it as a foundation for workshops. There's a logical overall structure. There's common definitions for the typical digital pipeline IT management systems. And I believe I have a fun little animation here. I mean, so you can imagine putting, I mean, I've done it using, you know, simply large Post-it notes and keeping a picture of the reference architecture projected in the room for people to refer to. You use the very large Post-it sheets, I'm sorry, not the notes. And then each of those, you can have 4 of those sheets for each of the value stream. And then maybe with the assistance of a projector, people can then actually put their systems and their processes on it. Now this represents, you know, a high-level sense-making exercise. It's not terribly precise, but the idea, you know, you'd simply tell people, put your systems and your processes on there, you know, however you understand them, you know, just to get a first cut of how people are viewing the world, get some situational awareness. Then, okay, well, which of these are your cues? And then give everybody 2 hotspots and say, vote on where you think the work is being blocked. You know, certainly you can also draw some high-level flows on how things are flowing, for example, from demand through build, through release, through change, through deployment, and then the all-important feedback loop from event back into defect. And where is the work getting blocked? In this particular example, you might see, well, people are saying that there's some significant blockages in the feedback loop from problem management back into defect management. This is perhaps where you might actually then dig out a level 2 IT4IT diagram, and I haven't talked about those yet. So you did see the high-level functional component diagram, but you should know that below the high-level level 1 functional components, we have more detailed diagrams. And so, for example, if I had a specific question I wanted to inquire about regarding, well, what is the relationship that IT4IT recommends or implies between problem and defect, we see that actually there is provision in IT4IT that problems and known errors should or can become defects. Or perhaps they flow into the portfolio demand component. Now that is highlighted in red. I think that's seen as an alternate path, whereas the normative path is through the defect component. But your mileage may vary. Reasonable people may disagree. And so you have a couple different options that you can think about here. Now, just as an aside, and this goes out to people who may have a more of an Agile background, I like to think of IT4IT as simply a set of design patterns. Sure, it could be used as a tool for assessment, and and as a standard, it provides some potential there. But in general, I like to use these kinds of standards as thinking tools and just tools that generate insight. I'm much less interested in conversations around conformance. It's just me. But I do think that does help if you're discussing these things with, for example, a person who is a very strong advocate from an Agile perspective. Now, one of the concerns that we often hear with IT4IT is, boy, this seems like it's only useful to the biggest of the big. Charlie, you talk about Wells Fargo, you talk about Shell. I'm not that big. Why do I need this thing? And so I want to take a little bit of a detour. Now, this is not part of the standard. This is actually work that I am currently pursuing. I have been developing what I call my magnum opus is this emergence model. It's a form of a capability model that I use in training and education. I use it in my class. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of St. Thomas, which has one of the larger software engineering and information systems programs in the country. And I had the problem of how do I educate my students when some of them come in with no industry experience. And so I hit on the idea, why don't we run them through a thought experiment of being in a startup and scaling it through the enterprise level. And you can see how we can also understand IT4IT in this way. I don't have time to go into great detail, but the idea with the startup to enterprise is that you start by asking, what's your IT value? What tools do you need to deliver it? and what is the nature of your application pipeline that will give you fast feedback in the market. And when it's just the two of you in a garage, that is all you have time to deal with. You do not have enterprise architects, you do not have IT service management, you don't have change managers, you don't have formalized risk management. You may be doing all these things subconsciously or in a tacit way, but you've not formalized them. And that's what this framework is about the degree in which you formalize and institutionalize certain practices, including what automated systems you use. And you will see there are even IT4IT systems that you need from day one in the garage. Then you have a state transition. You find that as founders, you're out now talking to customers, perhaps investors. You now have people in the garage that need to sort out the questions of what is my vision for the product, how am I doing my work. You still don't need extensive process management framework. At that stage in the maturity, we typically just see card walls and Kanban boards. But you still also have a concern for operations. That becomes a thing. The more interrupt-driven work starts to show up as customers accumulate and start to demand service in perhaps unpredictable ways. Then you hit the big ugly, the team of teams problem. This is the scaling problem by definition. You have to be attentive to culture and organization in a more systematic way. There's a lot of research emerging that culture actually impacts the bottom line, and we're getting a better understanding of how it does so. You need to understand how you're managing the competition for internal investment dollars and how you're executing in more complex and systematic ways requiring significant coordination, such as release change or enterprise change management. This is where you start to look at frameworks such as PMBOK and ITIL. And then finally, at the enterprise level, you're now concerned with powerful external forces such as regulators and adversaries and hackers. You need security and governance. You also have to be concerned with information, how you handle information. Pardon the phone ringing in the background. It's just going to have to continue. Then finally, you have architecture. So you have information management, which includes record management. You have architecture and portfolio, and at that point you have a fully elaborated digital pipeline in the enterprise. Now, how does this actually play out with IT4IT? Well, we can see, and I will make this statement quite definitively from day one in the garage, I would not start a company without having clear source control, build management, package management, and then some kind of deployment configuration management. Now, configuration management is a fairly broad term. I'm not talking about a full-blown CMDB, but I am talking about deployment here. Now, and as I said, these are not things that you wait on. I mean, source control, again, there's a lot, many folks, I think, the minute you start something, you put it in GitHub. I won't belabor these points. So at the team level, where you start to need the collaboration tools, and notice I have the little emergence model going in the upper right-hand corner, you start to need to systematically track requirements, and that also includes user stories, defects, tests. Perhaps you start to need some kind of a systematic ability to capture user and customer requests, so you have this ability for the customers to actually start to request fulfillment, but it's very simple, primitive workflow at that point. You're certainly not managing sophisticated service catalogs. Then at the scaling level, you are now in a multi-product paradigm. That's the key thing between across the scaling boundary, is that you move from team to team of teams. This also means that you move from single product to multi-product. This also introduces a whole new set of complexity. You start to need to manage the internal investment process and assess different proposals for portfolio. Perhaps you need a full-blown project component, although I will say we are seeing some movement in the industry away from project management towards just simply product management and ongoing continuous flow work management. Perhaps you need some more systematic ability to manage your offers, Perhaps you start to formalize problems and incidents and events in a bit more of a systematic way. They're no longer just work on the Kanban board. You actually need a formalized incident process with the dispatching and escalation and routing that is implied. And then finally, at the enterprise level, you start needing all of the rest. You start asking whether I need to do chargeback and showback, internal billing, policy and risk management, enterprise architecture. They all become things. So hopefully this is a useful view for those of you who might, look at this initial final build of IT for IT and think, whoa, this is just too much, this is not for me. Actually, I think at whatever level you're at, it can be for you. And you can also apply this from startup to enterprise thought experiment in the context of a large enterprise. It doesn't have to literally be a garage-based startup. It also reflects the journey of an individual as they move from an individual contributor to a team lead, to a general manager, to a high-level IT or digital executive. So that's another way to view the emergence model. So hopefully this is a useful reinterpretation of IT for IT. I've not presented this to too many audiences, so I'm very curious on feedback and any insights people have. Okay, shifting gears here. IT for IT is a formal standard. It has examinations. You can see more on this on the Open Group website. I won't go into a lot of details here. It's standard multiple choice exams. We've had a couple of other work streams that have been generated, I think, some helpful material. I was also a participant with a gentleman named Keith John from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise on IT service for the IT for IT reference architecture. This is a, we were using the word service, and the word service, of course, is used frequently in digital management, and yet if you really dig into the definitions, there's a lot of discussion and debate around how you actually define it. ITIL has weighed in. We looked at that and we still felt that there was some work that could be done. So it was actually a very interesting set of interactions, and while I want to emphasize that Keith and I and this paper, bear the responsibility, we did talk to quite a few people, including ITIL authors, people involved in the Taking Service Forward initiative, and we talked to a number of academics who also have skin in this game, because the whole question of how we define service is of interest to business school marketing faculty, for example. And we also had some conversations with people who were involved in ISIP, the International Society of Service Innovation Professionals. We arrived at, I felt, a surprising, I'll call it at least a rough consensus, that the trouble was that the word service was simply overloaded. And we were trying to pack too much into that word service. And so we started to unpack it and say, well, we have the transactional aspect of the service. Somebody rendered me a service. I went and I had a service today at the service station. They changed my oil. That's the specific interaction. Happened at a specific time and place, specific set of actors. And that's actually how the academics tend to view the word service, is the service act, the moment of truth where the act occurs. Now, the service offerings are what the value proposition is. This is roughly where the service management, the IT service management community, I would say, focuses. And they are very strong on distinguishing the offering from the system. The haircut is not the scissors. And so the service, and people say, well, the haircut is not the scissors, therefore the service is not the application. Now, that's a harder question to resolve, but this at least gives us some tools to reason about these kinds of questions. Again, very interested in the community's feedback on if these resonate for you and if these ways of breaking the discussion down are useful. And the white paper is available for free via the Open Group website. So a little bit, and we'll have some time for questions here, a little bit on using IT for IT. You can use it internally. If you are a company of any size, you can download it and use it entirely for internal purposes, for example, to develop a digital pipeline for within your organization, completely free. However, if you're going to monetize IT for IT, you need to support the standard financially. I think this is a very fair and reasonable way of doing industry standards. Now, let me advocate, and this is strictly from the Charlie Betts point of view. We've seen a variety of attempts to create open source, fully open, wikified IT management, digital management, open IT service management standards. They've all essentially failed. Don't see much of any evidence that they're making any progress. And as I watch these things come and go, I begin to realize that standards require a business model. Even if it's basically a not-for-profit kind of activity, you have to have a business model. And if you look at the standards that are out there that are successful in the market, they have those business models. And so the question is not whether or not IT4IT gets paid for. The question is how. It has to be paid for how. And there's only 2 or 3 different ways that I've seen that we can actually support these kinds of standards as a community. There are pros and cons. There are other ways to do it. But I think that this model, when I look at it from a pragmatic point of view and also from my idealistic point of view, I think that this is a reasonable and effective way of actually supporting the industry standard. So, how do you get involved? Your company, you are free to use IT4IT today. You don't need to, I think the open group might like to have your email, for promotional purposes. If you're going to monetize the standard or you want to get involved in developing it, you join it as a consortium. Your company needs to join the open group, and yes, you can be a sole proprietorship. There is a LinkedIn group for community feedback, and this is the same as the Archimate and TOGAF models. Now, I said earlier I was going to talk a little bit about benefits to standards participation for the individual. It's not just for product companies, and we really, if you're a chief architect for the, for service management, digital pipeline, DevOps, IT delivery, and you're working in, a significant size company or even, smaller company, doesn't matter. But if you're on the demand side, if you're on the customer side, we really would love to have you active in the standard. And here's how you make the business case for that. You will meet peers struggling with the same issues. You're not there just to listen to people present. You're there to actually work on cutting-edge problems in your domain, and you learn a lot by doing that. I actually get a little bored with the big conferences and classroom training. But when I'm in a collaborative discussion, wrestling, with a sticky problem and hearing different points of view from around the world, I think it's a wonderful way to meet people, to generate a network. And the cost, when you run the numbers, yeah, your company has to join the open group, but the conferences, the actual working sessions are roughly half, maybe a little bit more of what a big produced conference is, because the open group conferences are primarily working sessions. So, they have a different cost structure. And so you wind up, the registration winds up being $600, $700, $800 US, for example. And please don't, hold me to that. But that's, I think, typically what I've been paying. Whereas if I go to a 4 or 5 day conference that has, is filled with presentations at a big Las Vegas hotel, I'm going to spend at least $1,600 on that conference. So do the math. Okay. That is the extent of my presentation. And Birgit, are there any questions that have come in through the chat room? I'm in a full screen mode, so I can't see the chat room. Maybe I'll just go.
Yes, there are. Let me go back to that original message we received early this morning. Let's see here.
Sure. Let's just leave the question screen. Okay. Sorry.
From Michael in Toronto. I'm interested in how the operational phases. Oops, my screen just moved. I'm
sorry, that's my bad.
Can you hear me?
Just trying to get to. Yes, I'm sorry, Birgit. That's my bad.
I'm interested in how the operational phases of IT4IT can be used to provide feedback for the EA model and improve on it. The EA component in IT4IT seems somewhat isolated from the rest of the framework.
Absolutely it is. It is, in my view, and I will, again, I want to be clear that I'm speaking for myself at this point, but the beauty of an open standard like this is we can have these discussions in a fairly open way. So I'll give you my personal perspective. The EA component is currently underspecified, and one of the missing pieces that I believe IT4IT needs is an IT analytics or IT data warehouse capability. Now, if I go back to the high-level value streams, I bring this one up, you'll notice that intelligence and reporting is a supporting activity. Now, this is intelligence and reporting for the business of IT. This is intelligence and reporting and analytics on your digital pipeline. It's where a tool like Splunk might live in terms of the capabilities it's supporting. And so as we start to use IT4IT and this robust data architecture, and we start to aggregate these things into an IT data warehouse, then I think that that's where the feedback loop back into EA can go. Now, EA, of course, also has an important design and portfolio aspect, and we have had some discussions about, for example, the software and product portfolio, the master list of all of the software components and products in the enterprise, for example, the kind of data that comes out of a BDNA. And that has a clear relationship, I believe, with some of the configuration management space. So we wind up actually having to look at service system interactions across the two corners of the diagram. In some ways, I wish I could kind of just roll this diagram. This diagram almost needs to be rolled up into a tube because of that feedback loop. So I hope that that answered some of the question. Certainly, it's not a completed, there's not a completed product I can point to here. And other experts might point to different aspects. Certainly, there are any of a number of other IT4IT thought leaders who might have answered the question in a very different way.
Charlie, you ready for another question?
I am.
Okay. I'm just going through the list here. Let's see. I don't know if they sent some to you directly, perhaps. Oh, okay, here, another one. I'm curious why TOGAF is positioned as IT standard. TOGAF covers all functions.
I think you're probably talking about the, they're probably talking about this positioning IT4IT in the landscape. That's a philosophical, that's a deep philosophical question. I believe if you go into a Fortune 500 company and ask who is using TOGAF, at least 70 to 80% of the users would align under the CIO. Sure, we would have some enterprise architects who maybe have actually moved their enterprise or business architecture function out from under the CIO, but TOGAF remains, in terms of the community that leverages it, I think it still remains an IT standard. And this is one we can have, respectful debate about. But I'm always, I consider myself an IT pragmatist, and having been a senior EA in a very large organization, I'm very conscious of enterprise architecture overreach. The idea that architecture is business, yes, it is, but we need to be realistic about where it actually lives and, where it tends to align. Certainly you don't see people, discussing TOGAF and GAP in the same breath.
Okay, so let's see here. From Antonio, a question. You mentioned you view agile practices with concerned interest. What are the concerns that you see about agile practices? I understand you mentioned the lack of interest for standards. Is this a concern of yours? Well,
I don't know that I would go so far as to say concern, if I use the word concerned, that's not quite what I intended. I watch Agile with certainly great interest. And in general, I believe that the Agile movement is probably the most significant and valuable thing to have happened in IT in the past 15 years. And certainly as we see DevOps organizations able to deploy software with incredible speed and agility, 10 deploys a day, was the original presentation, and we now know that companies like Amazon and Google are just continuously deploying millions of changes a week. And they're doing this with improved stability, because that was always the old big bugaboo. If we increase the release tempo, stability will go down. That's been disproven, folks. There is no debate on that one anymore. You can have fast feedback, fast delivery, and improved stability. Where I would begin to use the word concerned with Agile is when you move into the team of teams question. Agile and I will hesitate and I will hasten to say Agile and related practices, or the Agile ecosystem, because there's all kinds of debate about Agile versus DevOps and where the boundaries, again, debates that I think are sometimes better for a beer. But when you get to the team of teams problem, you start to see people saying, well, we're just going to have Scrum of Scrums, or we need big release trains or big epics. And that's where my skepticism starts to kick in a little bit. And I say, really? Because Agile, scaling Agile, I mean, Agile's got this very strong team focus. It works very well there, Scrum and Kanban, high performance, cross-functional teams. Yeah, we all get that. But the coordination problem is different. And whether you're talking PMBOK or ITIL or Scaled Agile Framework or Lean Kanban for the enterprise, I believe that all the answers in the team-of-team space at this point are partial. I don't believe anybody's got it figured out. In fact, I believe team of teams and enterprise are wicked problems that actually you can't really figure out. And the best we're going to do is we're going to get to some useful patterns and have a conversation. But for example, an enterprise change process, here's the example I'll use with the Agile community. I'll say, okay, so you're in a big company. Your team has decided that they don't want to ship hard drives around, and instead they're gonna run terabytes or heck even petabytes across the wire as part of a big data center migration exercise. And as it turns out, your data team decides to do this the same weekend that your WAN team has decided for other reasons that they're going to take one of the major WAN links offline. Now, how are you going to prevent that kind of situation from happening and having a bad outcome if you don't have something akin to an ITIL enterprise change process, or some kind of enterprise signaling, synchronizing, cadencing mechanism where these kinds of things can be surfaced and discussed. And, that's where I think the concerns come in. I also think that, governance, and I've written extensively in chapter 10 of my book on the roots and foundations of governance and how governance is different from management. Governance emerges when you're trying to solve the other people's money problem. And I don't think that there's been some writers and thought leaders, like I believe Scott Ambler gets this well, there's been a few others. But in general, I don't think that governance is respected. I think it's seen as merely bureaucracy. And to write off governance as merely bureaucracy is just naivete and indicates that, the person is operating, pretty much with a team mentality and doesn't really understand the motivations and drivers at the executive level. I could go into records management and portfolio management as well, but I think I've made my point.
So, Charlie, I think we have time for just one more. We had a question
Sure.
from Wafas, and it goes back to your slides. It says slide 20, limited items, work in progress. Is this Kanban methodology? That's spelled K-A-N-B-A-N?
Yeah, limiting work in progress, actually, it's interesting. It's a big, Kanban is one mechanism for limiting work in process, but if you interchange process and progress, it's the same thing. But if you really want the seminal reference on work in process, go find the work of Don Reinertsen, R-E-I-N-E-R-T-S-E-N, and in particular a book called The Principles of Product Development Flow. Now, Don Reinertsen is, I call him the man behind the curtain of Agile. He's not a well-known name himself, but his ideas are pervasive in the Agile community. He may well be one of the most cited authors when you read the other thought leaders' books, which is interesting. Go to the source. And for example, and just in terms of his influence, David Anderson, who wrote the book Kanban, credits conversations with Reinertsen as being part of his inspiration. And Dean Leffingwell, who created the Scaled Agile framework, explicitly credits Reinertsen as being the basis of many of the ideas in SAFe. So again, go to the source, Don Reinertsen. You heard it here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. I just sent a link to that book to all the attendees.
Excellent.
Okay, so I think we've covered all the questions. I don't know if some questions were sent to you directly. You may want to just take a quick look.
Okay, let me see here. I'll switch out to WebEx, and we have some complaints that people are, all of a sudden people couldn't hear anymore. Oh, in my experience, how was governance implemented in a DevOps model? We are at time. Do we want to do one more? People?
Sure.
Okay?
We can do just one more, and this will have to be the last.
Okay, all right. In your experience, how was governance implemented in a DevOps model that does inhibit the generation of information for fast requirements? The question's a little bit paradoxical. I would say that if it's, it does not inhibit. So I would refer the questioner to the DevOps Audit Defense Toolkit. So it's a quick answer there. So Google DevOps Audit Defense Toolkit by Gene Kim and Jim DeLucia. That will, I think, give you a great place to start in answering that question about DevOps and governance and fast feedback. It's not a complete answer, but it's a great start.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. So thank you, Charlie, for an excellent presentation. We've gotten some fabulous feedback saying, great presentation, and you're a real subject matter expert in this area. So well done. I hope to have you on another AEA webinar. And just a reminder, folks, this session was recorded, and we will upload that to the AEA site along with the presentation slides. If you have any additional questions, please send those to us. You can send those to customercare@globalee.org, and we'll send those to Charlie, or send them to Charlie directly. And we look forward to having you back again, Charlie, and thank you all for attending today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit.